Hello and welcome to another episode of the Iraqi Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Juma Iraqi. Before we start today's episode, I just want to mention that this podcast is available on YouTube, but you can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud as well. Sorry that there hasn't been an episode for a while now, but I'm very happy to have a very special guest today. She's one of my colleagues at Academy for Personal Training, and we've been actually trying to schedule this podcast several times now during the last couple of months, but there seems to be stuff coming up all the time. But finally, Melina, we made it.
Yes, we finally made it. We're both busy people, it seems.
Yeah, but I'm glad we finally got a chance to do this podcast today. So before we start, I also want to mention that we recently started an Instagram account, Iraqi Nutrition, a couple of months ago, which has been going very well. We have almost 22,000 followers at the moment, and we frequently post infographics related to training, nutrition, supplementation, and fitness related stuff. So definitely give that a check out and follow us. So Melina Magulas is the name, which you're originally half Norwegian and half from Greece.
That's right.
Correct? Yeah. And you've also been representing the Greece country skiing lately. Is that correct?
I've been spending some time in Austria representing Greece in the Nordic World Championship in cross-country skiing, which is a little bit exotic when you come from Greece, I guess. But it was a great experience to be able to take part in a world championship.
Excellent. And my understanding is that you did quite well in that championship as well.
It depends. It depends on the context. But well, as you know, Juma, I spend a lot of time at work, which I love. So skiing is not really my main priority. It's just something that I do on the side. So in that context, I did pretty well. Yes. So I would say I'm a semi-professional skier, not
Awesome.
professional.
I think maybe your husband was a bit more satisfied with the results, as he is the Norwegian head coach for the cross country skills for males.
That's true. They took all the goals that you could possibly win in the championship. So, of course, he was thrilled, and it was great to have that experience with him. He's also coaching me, and we were there together and experiencing getting all those goals, and his athletes doing so great. It was just amazing.
Yeah, I can imagine. And funny how such a small country as Norway being so dominant in a sport like cross country, it's quite amazing.
It is. But I guess we're doing something right up here in the north.
Yeah, absolutely. So today's topic is we're going to talk about concurrent training.
Yeah.
You, with your background, have a lot of experience and also a lot of knowledge about endurance training. So I think this will be a great topic. But before we start with the questions, could you give the listeners an introduction about yourself?
Absolutely. So, as you said, Juma, I'm based here in Oslo, half Greek, half Norwegian. And my academic background is in sports science, primarily in exercise physiology, but I've also dabbled in biomechanical research. So I have a master's degree from the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences. And after my master's degree there, I continued on with research in a biomechanics group, studying the muscle-tendon unit system primarily, and how it adapts to a training modality called stretching, which is a completely different topic from today. And aside from that, on the day-to-day basis, I work as an exercise physiologist at a place called Magnat Center in Oslo, Norway, and it's an interdisciplinary center with doctors, psychologists, and exercise physiologists like myself, coaches, and we take care of athletes, the average Joe patients, yeah, everyone who needs help with their health and performance. And I also have the great pleasure of working with you, Juma, at the Academy for Personal Training, and love lecturing and also public speaking and just communicating and discussing with others about all the topics that I'm passionate about, but especially human performance and especially endurance training, which is part of the topic today. So I guess that's the most important things, I guess.
Excellent. And I think we both agree that probably the most enjoyable things we both do is doing the lectures for Academy for Personal Training. Not because you get a chance to present on topics you're really interested in, but also you get to meet a lot of fun people. You get great students, great colleagues, and great owners.
Absolutely, and it's not just the thing that we want to stand there and take the spotlight and be the stars of everything. It's not the standing in front of the people part that we love. It's like you say, we meet the students and they will come up with questions that challenge us and will make us think twice about things that we probably perhaps accepted as common knowledge. So it makes us, I think they keep us on our toes a little bit. And it's also a great help remembering all the details that well, some of them, let's be honest, you would have forgotten them if you weren't teaching them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like take biochemistry, for example. I literally had to find my old biochemistry books and read up on a lot of things that I hadn't even touched on I haven't touched on those things probably since I did my undergraduate, but when I started lecturing for AFPT, I had to refresh a lot of these things because that's one of the topics that I do lecture in. So definitely agree with you on that. So let's jump into the questions, and let's start with defining what actually concurrent training is. What are we talking about when we say concurrent training?
Yeah, so concurrent training, it deals with it has to do with what I would call actually real life, real world training, because it's a form of training where you incorporate several training forms or training modalities, if you will. So it can be you have both strength training and you're incorporating endurance training in the same session. That would be an example of concurrent training. Concurrent training can also be, let's say you have two different training sessions on the same day, and one of them would be endurance training and the other one would be perhaps strength training. Or even in the same period. So it is about incorporating different training modalities in the same period. It could be a mesocycle, for example, or on the same day, or perhaps even in the same very session. So it's about mixing things up a little bit. And I guess that's how a lot of people train in the daily life.
Yeah, I would agree on that, but specifically athletes do train, even though you're primarily an endurance athlete or primarily that's what you do as a sport, there's often also a strength component to the type of training that you do. Probably more now than it used to be previously in a lot of sports. Like, for example, soccer is a good example where there wasn't really a lot of culture for doing a lot of resistance training previously, but now it's been more of the main standard of actually doing more resistance training, even though they're training for, like, endurance is mainly what you're looking for when you're a soccer, but depends on the position. But
yeah, absolutely. And I think all sports have the strength component that you mentioned, and also now more than even just, let's say, 5 to 10 years ago, there are many sports where people were still, and there still are skeptics, but people were a lot more skeptical in the endurance community about using strength training as a part of their training. And I guess perhaps it's rooted in some old fear of gaining muscle mass and you won't run fast enough or something like that. But now more and more endurance athletes, both runners and skiers, and in all kinds of endurance type sports, will incorporate strength training as a part of their training week, because they experience, and we know now that it will enhance their performance, and it could possibly help prevent injuries as well. So more and more athletes are training concurrently.
Interesting. Now, if you don't know this channel has about 12,000 subscribers, and I get the impression that most of them are like me, they're muscle heads, so their main interest is muscle hypertrophy. So that's the direction we're going to go with the questions that I'm going to answer, because that is what I know people are interested in knowing more about. So let's talk about how endurance training can potentially affect molecular signaling that might be important for muscle hypertrophy.
Yeah, okay. So let's go, before we go there, I want to take us a little bit back to where it all started, because concurrent training is a fairly new research area. It actually started in the 1980s with the work of Robert Hickson. And the anecdote says that he started adding, I mean, he was, like you said, a muscle head, but he started adding endurance sessions to his training. And he noticed that he wouldn't gain, or at least he didn't feel like he gained muscle mass as fast as before when he added these endurance sessions. So, and that was sort of the origin or the beginning of the research into concurrent training, because Dr. Hickson, he experienced that he wasn't gaining as fast as usual. So why would that be? And could it possibly be that endurance training was interfering somehow with his gains? So the studies from Dr. Hickson's lab was the first studies to show, in air quotes, that endurance training would interfere with hypertrophy. And a lot of papers still cite his pioneer papers, which is often, as you would know, it's often a good sign or a good thing to cite pioneer papers. But there is there are some issues with the methods that they used to measure hypertrophy, because they used a measurement of circumference. So they took a measuring tape and measured around the muscles, and we know now that it's not the best way to measure hypertrophy. So because there could be other reasons that, rather than, it could be swelling, other things that would make the muscle grow or not grow. So using a measuring tape is definitely not the best technique to measure hypertrophy, but that's where it all started, this research. And it has continued, and one of the theories is that the signaling pathway for hypertrophy is being blundered or a little bit hampered with when you also get the signaling from the endurance training. And as I've been listening to your podcast, I've heard that several of your other guests has mentioned the mTOR pathway, or the pathway of mechanistic target of rapamycin, which is known as an anabolic pathway for hypertrophy. It will cause the muscles to grow when you trigger this pathway. And so you have this this mTOR pathway on the one side, which is the anabolic pathway to muscle growth, to hypertrophy. And on the other side, you have another pathway, which has to do with AMPK. And there are some components of the AMPK pathway that has been shown in vitro to blunt the mTOR pathway. And this has not consistently been shown in humans, but it has been shown in animal studies and it has been shown in vitro studies. So it's still a little bit up for discussion whether or not the signaling pathway for hypertrophy is at all hampered with in humans when we train concurrently. So that was a long explanation, but there is talk of what we call the interference effect. And that has to do with the fact that training one training modality or one training form, such as endurance type training, which is known to trigger more catabolic pathways concurrently with a strength training regimen, could perhaps hamper with the hypertrophy or strength effects. So in conclusion, or at least we can conclude that this is the case yet. But so there are some studies that will tell you that you will not gain muscle as fast as with concurrent training as opposed to training only resistance-based training. And those results are pretty consistent because if you do train only strength training alone compared with concurrent training, you will have faster hypertrophy gains compared to a group that would train concurrently. So that is probably one of the most important points, that it's not that you will not get hypertrophy with concurrent training, because you will, but you will probably not gain it as fast as with strength training only.
Great, that was a great explanation. I do have some follow-up questions regarding AMPK, and I know this is not your area, but nutrition-wise, do you know if any of these macronutrients have an effect on AMPK? Because we often talk about carbohydrate replenishment or to replenish glycogen after training, and we do know that we don't decrease our glycogen stores as much when we do strength resistance training compared to endurance training. But do carbohydrates have an effect on AMPK, and that might lead on to have a better effect for the anabolic signaling? Do you know anything about that?
Well, you're right. That is not my area, Juma. I actually haven't looked into the nutritional or potential nutritional responses to whether or not you increase MPK or you blunt MPK pathway with different nutritional strategies. So I couldn't answer that.
Sorry for putting you on the spot.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
No.
Let's move on to the next follow-up. Regarding fiber types, how would that affect when you do concurrent training?
Well, if you think about in terms of hypertrophy, in terms of growth,
yeah.
Well, in terms of well, I don't know that you would have different different responses to, for example, resistance training with concurrent training, because I haven't seen any studies that would show that you have more hypertrophy in one fiber type or the other. And there's also a different topic to study. There's also a lot of issues with how you study fiber types. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we can say for sure in humans that concurrent training would affect one type fiber type more than the other, as opposed to strength training alone. Perhaps you have some different knowledge than me. I don't know.
No. I'm just asking.
And I think also the research isn't there yet because, as I said, this is a fairly new research area. So the research focuses mostly on to which degree do you gain muscle mass, to which degree do you get hypertrophy, to which degree do you gain strength, and how does concurrent training affect power measurements, for example, power output, how does it affect sprint, jumping height, those types of performance measures.
Interesting.
But there is definitely a want and need for more in-depth and even more detailed research. And I know there's research going on expression on different types of myosin and also gene expression. So I think there will be a lot more coming.
Interesting. It's funny you mentioned the thing with some of these pioneer studies that we often go back to and reference because they were the first. There does often, not often, but you sometimes see some methods that were used that would never like fly today because of the degree of error that you have with these measurements compared to what we have today. That's one thing. But what I find interesting sometimes is going back and looking at these old studies, and then you're looking at it and you see what they actually put the subjects through, and you think that would never be approved today.
No. And I guess perhaps I'm only theorizing, but perhaps because maybe the ethics committees weren't as strict as they are now, but perhaps because of that, maybe some of the early studies could show some extreme effects that we struggle to reproduce today, because there are things that we wouldn't put our subjects through, which a lot of researchers did on themselves, or they perhaps motivate their subjects through. That is very interesting. But of course, we should pay a lot of respect to these pioneer studies, as well as Dr. Hickson's study, even though we would not measure in the same way, because they started everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. One good example of a study, I don't know if it would be difficult. I do know that there has been talk of trying to replicate a study like that in elderly, but there's been some issues with ethics regarding that, and that is the Bazin studies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but Bazin did a couple of studies where he basically used supraphysiological doses of testosterone, which is 600 milligrams a week of testosterone that he used, way more than TRT dosages. And basically the 1996 study was basically trying to see what actually happened with supraphysiological doses of testosterone, which was quite impressive, not for the group that only trained, but there was a group there that used these dosages and didn't train, and they actually had more gains than the group that trained and had the placebo, which is quite astonishing, to be honest, that you actually saw such a degree of gains. But anyway, I think you would have a difficult time trying to get a study like that approved today, and it's
kind of a freak study.
Yeah, it's kind of, and he has a series of these studies as well, trying to look at the dose response of testosterone as well, which do show that the more you take, the bigger the gains are. So again, I think it would be difficult to get a study like that approved. Anyways, moving on forward with I'm interested in this interference effect endurance training might have on resistance training. But the next question would be, does all types of endurance training have this interference effect, or do we see that some types of endurance training have more of a detrimental effect on the signaling that is important to muscle hypertrophy?
Yeah, and I guess we can also I feel like you should try to explain this signaling a little bit better, but maybe we'll swing back to that. But when it comes to different training modalities, absolutely, there is a difference to what you do. And this is very important for coaches to take note of. Because, for example, there are studies showing that the muscle damage that you will see in subjects or athletes after a running intervention is more or greater than, for example, after an intervention done in cycling. So, and that is because of the large eccentric component that you have in running, which you don't have in cycling. And also, if we take that over in the concurrent training area, we see that if you do cycling and train concurrently and concurrently do strength training or resistance training on the same muscle groups, aka in the legs, you will have a better chance of gaining muscle mass than if you were running, for example. So cycling could be a better option, or a more low impact training modality as opposed to running. So, for example, if you have an athlete and it's important to have, or hypertrophy is your focus, I would definitely consider using low impact ergometers like rowing ergometer, maybe the dreaded assault bike, or just a cycling ergometer to diminish this eccentric load, to again diminish the or lessen the muscle damage, and you are probably have you're probably more, what can I say? It's more likely that it will help you gain muscle mass while you're taking care of also your endurance capacity, if that was important. So for CrossFitters, for example, this could be an excellent choice. Also for bodybuilders, we know that it's important to do some type of endurance or cardiovascular training for health reasons and health benefits. So maybe the cycling ergometer is the go-to when you want to preserve, take care of, and enhance your muscle mass.
Interesting. And what about does intensity matter? Because I know a lot of bros will probably think, or I know a lot of bros will have this question: how much is my fasted morning cardio affecting my training? That's one. Let's start with that, and then I'll move on to a couple of other bro questions that I know of.
Absolutely. Well, I won't answer for the nutritional side of part of things, because you can fill in much better than I can there. Intensities seem to do matter, and I've seen some of the work by Jackson Fife. I think it was some of his studies, maybe. But anyway, check out Jackson Fife studies, folks, if you're interested in reading more about concurrent training. I think these are some of the studies. Anyway, where two groups were compared. One was doing moderate continuous training, and the other one was doing high intensity interval training, while concurrently doing strength training in an hypertrophy protocol. And the group that did the continuous training in moderate intensity did not gain as muscle mass in the same rate as the group that did the high intensity interval training. And actually what they saw in the high intensity interval training group was that the mTOR phosphorylation increased. And mTOR is the signaling pathway for hypertrophy. And when you upgrade the mTOR pathway, the end result could be that you increase muscle protein synthesis. So actually it may be that high intensity interval training can promote hypertrophy. Maybe this is like taking it a little bit too far in theory, but at least they saw this increase in mTOR phosphorylation, which is sort of an anabolic sign. So,
Interesting.
So I mean, you could do higher intensity for less time and probably get better cardiovascular effects, and possibly further enhance or at least not hamper with your gains.
Interesting. Now, I know another question that probably people would want an answer to is, when we're talking about interference with muscle hypertrophy, are we talking that it can potentially affect the whole body, or is it locally to the muscle groups that being worked? So, for example, if you're doing a lot of endurance, like a lot of running, or endurance where you're using a lot of legs, are we seeing that it might affect the gains in your legs, or can it also affect the upper body?
That is a very good question, a question that I get a lot, actually. And the answer is, it seems to be locally, because, let's take an example. If you do running intervals 2 times a week, and then you strength train your legs 2 to 3 times a week, that is 4 to 5 really tough sessions on your legs. When will you recover? I mean, so that means that, well, in that respect, I would probably try to put the leg sessions as far away from each other as possible, because what we do see is that I should be a little bit wary of saying blunting of hypertrophy with endurance training, but to some extent that is what it is. What we do see is that if you train, let's say if you run and do a tough, hard, long, sweaty sesh with running, you could still strength train your upper body in the same session and have pretty good gains. So you should try to think about what muscle group am I training today or tomorrow, and what sort of training modality should I use today if I'm doing some endurance work, so it won't interfere with the strength gains and or the hypertrophy gains, because we have to keep those things a little bit separate as well. But it really does matter which muscles you use and when you use them, and for what type of training modality.
Excellent. Now, the thing is that one of the things that you mentioned regarding like doing intervals and then training legs and when will you recover, I think that's one of the things that people sometimes forget, that if you are going to do intervals training, that's adding in training that you also need to recover from. Many physique athletes would opt to do steady state, low intensity cardio just to actually have it as a function to expend more calories. How much would you say that is interfering with your gains compared to doing something like interval training?
I would say it's pretty hard to quantify. And I certainly don't have the answer, and I don't know that anyone does. When you talk about how much, I mean, this quantification of it. But I think if you, based on the theory that we have and also what I see in practice, I think that if you're using the endurance type of endurance training as a means to burn more calories in order to maybe calorie restrict your diet because you're going to hit certain targets,
you're going to get shredded.
You're going to get shredded.
Yeah.
Let's just call it what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, to get shredded, basically. I think interval training is a lot more clever and faster way of doing that, because when you are doing any type of aerobic activity, which is what we're doing right now, this is aerobic or aerobic training. For example, the typical bodybuilder workout, which is, for example, being on the elliptical for 45 minutes with a low intensity. You won't burn much because using 1 liter of oxygen it takes some time, and 1 liter of oxygen expended is 5 calories. But if you increase your oxygen uptake and you can do a larger work, you will use more calories per time. So if you improve your physical form, by that I mean your cardiovascular fitness, you can do larger work and you can expend more calories in the same amount of time, or you can expend more calories than before in a shorter amount of time. So if it's about the calories, it's a lot faster and healthier, I would say, to use high intensity interval training. But what I would do then is recommend elliptical, cycling, something with low impact. That would be an important point. And if more studies will in fact confirm this possible added bonus with the mTOR phosphorylation, maybe that will be an even better way to go with the interval training. I think this continuous endurance training on the low intensity and the fat burn zone, you could say, I think it's more rooted in tradition than actual scientific knowledge.
Interesting. That's a great explanation and great answer. Moving on to the next question. Let's say if you were to do both, how would you structure that to make it not like minimize the interference effect of the two types of training?
So of course it depends on the training frequency, on the athlete or the person. What is their main focus? But let's say hypertrophy is the main focus. Well, we don't know really, and there isn't that much proof that doing quite a lot of endurance training will at all affect hypertrophy. But we know it will affect strength, because we see quite good hypertrophy gains in groups that have been doing substantial work in the endurance field as well. And we see that in athletes also that has both a strength component and an endurance component in their sport. So for hypertrophy, I wouldn't be all that worried unless you all of a sudden start to, you get very interested in doing triathlons and Ironmans and you still want to preserve the muscle mass. I would say we might have a little bit of a conflict, but unless it's extreme amounts of or large amount of endurance training, I would not actually be worried about hypertrophy at all. But if we're talking about strength, I would be a lot more conscious about where I would place the workouts. So I would try to place, especially the leg workouts, if you're doing cycling, running, any type of weight-bearing endurance activity, I would try to place those sessions as far away from the strength sessions as possible. I would do the strength session early on the day or in the morning if you're doing 2 sessions a day, if you're so fortunate that you can do that. And do an endurance session in the evening. And also a general recommendation that I see a lot of both coaches and researchers fall back on all the time is the 6-hour rule. That you should have at least 6 hours in between the sessions for optimal gains in both types of training, both endurance and resistance training. So at least you can think about that, the 6-hour rule, and also placing the workouts as far away from each other as possible. But with that being said, a lot of people use concurrent training because they're strapped for time, are time bankrupt. And I get asked a lot, and I also been speaking a lot about, how can time bankrupt athletes and time bankrupt people in general, how can they improve both? How can they gain muscle mass, and how can they improve their cardiovascular fitness, in the same session? Is it even possible? And my answer is yes, it's possible, but maybe you won't, reach an elite level in either of the training forms or training types or the properties. But at least if you structure your workout in accordance with the human physiology, you can and will get results over time. And how you should structure the session then is you should start with the most explosive, the most power requiring movements, for example, power training in the beginning of the training session. And then you can move on to a strength training part or resistance training part. And then you can finish the workout off with some endurance based activity. For example, high intensity intervals. A lot of people love the Tabata intervals or the 4 times 4 minutes intervals as sort of a finisher on the workout. And that would be a workout for the time bankrupt mom or dad or student or the average Joe.
I think love is a strong word for interval training, to be honest.
Okay. Love-hate relationship.
Yeah, I think that's more appropriate.
Yeah, and if you get on that assault bike, I would say the word hate comes to mind.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right.
6-hour rule. That was my sort of main takeaway. 6-hour rule. That is a go-to.
Excellent. Now let's wrap this podcast up with what should the listeners have as a take-home message from what we've been discussing today?
Yeah. To summarize, this is a topic that is still a lot of development. So we start to know a little bit about concurrent training, but there is a lot more research to be done. And I know people always say that, but about concurrent training, it really is the truth. It hasn't been researched enough, and it's quite challenging. But we know now, or we can be pretty certain that it will take enormous amounts of endurance training for an individual not to have hypertrophy gains. If you have a solid hypertrophy program, and if you're not in a very calorie restricted situation, because you need to have everything set up for muscle protein synthesis. For strength, training concurrently could possibly interfere with strength gains, and training concurrently can also interfere with strength performance and also power performance. We didn't address that in this podcast, but I'll say it now. And that is also why you should start with the power and strength part of the training if you're doing concurrent training in the same session. And also, if you're doing 2 sessions a day, start with the power and strength training first. If that is the training that is most important to you. If you're an endurance athlete, I would say, switch it up. Start with it. That's different. So, and also, if you're doing strength and endurance training on the same day, try to allow as much time in between sessions as possible in order to make sure that you don't have any residual fatigue, especially if you, for some reason, are doing the strength training after the endurance training. Some residual fatigue may interfere with how much you can lift, with your strength performance, with your power performance, and how much you can lift, how much work you can do. That will also affect your strength gains in the future. But as long as you push yourself to maybe not failure, but almost to failure, you can still see hypertrophy gains, but maybe you won't see as large strength gains if you did endurance training right before the session. That was a long summary, but I think those are the most important points.
Perfect. I think the listeners will enjoy and have great value from that take-home message. Melina, thank you so much for taking the time to do this podcast. It's been awesome to have you on, and like I said, we finally made it. Got the time to make this podcast. But before we sign off, where can the listeners find more information about you?
Well, you can find me at Melina Magulas at Twitter, at Instagram, at Facebook, everywhere. It's my handle is Melina Magulas in one word. Mm-hmm. And well, I try to put up quite a lot of content on my Instagram, which is where you will find me producing some content most of the time. But I love a good tweetable.
Excellent. Definitely check her out on Instagram. She posts a lot of useful information geared toward endurance athletes, and I'm quite impressed with it's so fun to watch the stories that you share, because not only is it informational, but it's also very graphically pleasing to look at. So I might need to steal some tips from you on that part.
Nerd.
So once again, Melina, thank you so much. Thank you all to the listeners that checked this podcast out. Make sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you don't already have done so. And yeah, you'll have a good night, Melina. It's almost bedtime for both of us if we're gonna recover for tomorrow's training session. Absolutely. All right, Melina, thank you so much, and we'll speak soon again.
We will. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.